Welcome to Journeys Through Sociology, a series of interviews with the Executive Committee of the International Sociological Association. I'm Lalebe Bohanyan, and our guest today is Dr. Tina Uys, who is joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa. Dr. Uys is a professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg, where she is also the director of the Center for Sociological Research. She earned her PhD in sociology from Rand Afrikaans University. She is a former president of the South African Sociological Association and is currently serving as the vice president of national associations for the ISA. Dr. Uys has done research on issues relating to HIV/AIDS, as well as developments in higher education. Her primary research right now focuses on whistleblowing in South Africa, on which she is currently writing a book. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Uys.
It's a pleasure.
It's wonderful to have you with us. And there's actually a number of questions that I'd like to ask you today. Before we start to really dig into your history as a sociologist, I'd like to kind of begin in the present and get a bit of a sense of the kind of work that you're currently doing. So, you know, I know that you're involved in many things, teaching, research, various forms of administration. But in terms of the work that you're doing now, what would you say, what aspect of it are you particularly excited about?
Well, apart from my research on whistleblowing and the book that I'm trying my best to write, I'm also involved in a departmental research project, which is on student communities. So we are doing research on student communities at my own university, but we're also collaborating with the University of Pretoria, which is also in South Africa, and then the University of Hyderabad in India.
So this is a comparative research on student communities in these different universities?
Yes, we're specifically looking at contested identities of students and issues around how they fit in on campus, the challenges that they experience, things like survival strategies of students, which is quite a big issue in the South African context, perhaps less so at the Indian university that we are comparing ourselves with. But we think it's going to be fascinating to see how different issues play out in similar ways or in different ways at the different universities.
So when you speak about survival strategies of South African students, can you maybe give us a sense of what that means actually for South African students?
Well, one is definitely financial in nature. Especially at my own university, which has been rapidly transforming in the last 10 years or so, and has now become 80% Black student body. A lot of these students are first-generation university students. A lot of them don't have a lot of financial resources at their disposal. They struggle in various ways. And there are lots of anecdotal evidence for the kinds of problems that they're experiencing. We want to find out to what extent those anecdotal evidence is actually true. Mm-hmm. But there are also other survival strategies, survival issues. And one of them is coping with academic demands that are placed on them. Mm-hmm. Most people might not be aware of the fact, but we have serious problems in South Africa with regard to our educational system, especially high schools. And the government has been struggling for a number of years to get those problems resolved. And those problems feed into the universities, so that the universities have to overcome some of the lack of foundation that students should have received at school level, which they now have to get at university level. So there are those kinds of issues as well. And then, of course, there are the normal issues that students face everywhere, and that has to do with this transition from being a child to being a young adult, for a lot of them leaving home and trying to survive and cope on your own. And so it's a transition in more than one way. a transition in terms of a time phase, but also a transition in terms of moving from one area to another area. And then also those who still stay at home, the challenge of negotiating between the university life and the demands that the university life places on them, and then also the demands from their home environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Dr. one of the things actually I'm interested in as you speak about the work that you're doing in terms of addressing some of the challenges that university students are facing in South Africa. And I know that you have a long history of kind of building South African sociology. You're the chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg and the director of the Center for Sociological Research. So one of the things that I'm interested in is how you were drawn to sociology in particular. So when you look back, can you perhaps identify for us some of the reasons that you've been drawn to sociology?
I landed in sociology by accident. Sociology is not a course that is offered at school level in South Africa. So at the stage when most of our students arrive at university, they have no idea what sociology is about. And I didn't know either. I think I might probably not have landed up in sociology if my degree course that I chose didn't make sociology a compulsory subject. But even in my first year, I immediately realized that this is the course for me, and became very interested in it. Initially, psychology was going to be my other major, apart from communication. And I decided I dropped psychology in my second year, and I continued with sociology.
So what was it about sociology that led you immediately to feel like this was for you?
One element of it was the kind of issues that were addressed in sociology. I found that I was actually much more interested in looking at relationships, from interpersonal relationships to teams, to organizations, to groups, to communities, to society as a whole. I'm more interested in what makes relationships between people, between organizations, between groups work, and what kind of problems do they experience, how do you resolve those kinds of problems. And then another thing was a kind of a mentor that I had in my first year. One of the senior professors who taught us, even on a first year level, who was really a very exciting kind of lecturer, very involved with her students. And she started encouraging me from my second year onwards to continue with sociology.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So those were the reasons that initially this accident that brought you to sociology, and you saw that, you know, this way of thinking about the world in terms of relationships suited you much more in terms of what you were interested in. As you continue to work as a sociologist, what is it that continues to draw you? What is it that continues to make the work that you do? I mean, for example, you brought up whistleblowing and the book that you're writing right now. I'm hoping that we do get a chance for you to tell us a little bit about that book and how it is that as a sociologist you're approaching that issue.
Well, again, I landed in that also by accident. What happened was that my husband was a whistleblower, but I had never come across the concept of whistleblowing. I just couldn't understand why his employer was responding to him in the way they were. And then one of my colleagues gave me an article to read on whistleblowing, and it was like a world opening up for me. So I, to a certain extent, started researching whistleblowing as a kind of coping mechanism to cope with the very traumatic experiences that we went through. And I became fascinated by it, by how organizations respond, by issues around resilience, for example, of the whistleblower, issues around...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but for our viewers who may not be familiar with this term, can you just explain to us just generally what whistleblowing means?
Whistleblowing is when a member of an organization discloses information about what they perceive to be wrongdoing to somebody inside or outside the organization that they think could do something about it. Mm-hmm. And what generally tends to happen with these whistleblowers, even if they start disclosing the information or raise their concerns internally within the organization starts to victimize them, starts to respond negatively, starts to isolate them, blacklist them, and often starts to put procedures in place to get rid of them, to fire them if they can, in any way.
So, and your book focuses on whistleblowing in the context of South Africa, correct? Or
yes, yes. Because what interested me when I started reading about whistleblowing was that it was quite well developed in the USA, a quite well developed concept there, and lots of research being done there, also in the UK, and some research in Europe and even in Russia. But in South Africa, there was very little, and more or less at the same stage. South Africa introduced legislation to protect whistleblowers. And I was also interested in looking at this legislation and looking at the shortcomings and how this legislation could be strengthened. Mm-hmm. So it became sort of like a life work, if you like.
Yes. So, and you mentioned, whistleblowing in the U.S. or in the U.K. So, internationally, are there major differences in terms of the process or the consequences in different parts of the world that you can identify?
There are lots of similarities in terms of how organizations tend to respond to whistleblowers. The differences are mainly with regard to the extent to which the protection of whistleblowers is effective or not. And there's a whole debate, and I've got one student who's looking at this to a certain extent. There's a debate about whether national traditions play a role in whether whistleblowers can be protected effectively by legislation. My own point of view is that legislation can just protect whistleblowers to a certain extent, and that they have to carefully think about what they're letting themselves in for when they decide to disclose information.
Mm-hmm. And are there any forms of protection aside from legal? Are there efforts outside of the legal realm of addressing this?
In South Africa, there is an NGO called ODAC. It's the Open Democracy Advice Center, and they do provide some assistance to whistleblowers. So they would try and they do some research about it, and they try and give whistleblowers some support. But it's actually very limited. And I've done interviews with about 20 whistleblowers so far, South African whistleblowers. And in most cases, it is quite a negative story, in the sense that even those who went the full course with the legislative protection, they went up to as far as the labor court, which is the final instance that they can go to. They generally find that they are financially much worse off, that they've lost their career, that they have to go into a different direction and start over again as a result of raising concerns.
Mm-hmm. So, Doctor, there's another issue that I'd like for you to speak on, and that we've been asking of the various ISA Executive Committee members that we've been interviewing, is to speak about some of the challenges of being a sociologist. And we've had all kinds of issues raised, the challenges of the boundaries of sociology, whether in terms of disciplines or in terms of perhaps a Eurocentric kind of history of sociology, the challenges, economic challenges of language, of trying to be locally relevant but engaging globally. So collectively, the ISA members at this point have really kind of put a whole bunch of issues on the table that I think are faced by sociologists all over the world. And I would be really interested in hearing your thoughts on this. In your experience as a sociologist, what would you say have been some of the most kind of significant challenges that you faced?
Well, one of the challenges is the massification of universities in South Africa. In my own department, we have 11 members of staff, and we have over 2,000 undergraduate students alone, and about 60 postgraduate students, which is a very demanding way of living your sociological life. For example, on our first year level, we don't have venues that are big enough to accommodate the 1,200 first year students we have. So we have to repeat our lectures 3 times, which is quite exhausting. Another challenge that we face in the university, in particular with regard to teaching, is that a large number of our students are doing their university work by means of a second, third, or fourth language. So there are challenges in terms of language issues. There are also challenges in the sense of a lot of our students being first generation university students. So they're not familiar, they cannot get this kind of support that a student whose parents and grandparents have gone to university that they would get. And they find the university a very strange and very daunting place to begin with. And we find that more and more it is our job as lecturers, not only to teach them sociology, but to also help them fit in on the campus. And that's part of the reason why we decided to do this research project, because we want to find out exactly what these challenges are that our students are facing and how we can go about assisting them.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like, though, these challenges are actually kind of simultaneously coming hand in hand with the kind of wonderful reality that there are so many students in your sociology classes, and the challenge of meeting those demands and all of those needs, but also that you have such a large kind of community of students of sociology that are, as you said, many of which, for whom this is their first generation in their families of being university students. So it sounds like a challenge that holds a lot of promise as well.
Yes. So on the one hand, we're very excited about the fact that sociology is a popular discipline in my university, and that we have lots of very excellent students, and that is very rewarding to work with these students and to see how they grow and how they develop, and how some of them at least decide that they want to become sociologists themselves. And enabling them to learn a whole range of skills that they can also apply in a variety of different contexts, not necessarily only as sociologists. So that is very rewarding. Mm-hmm. But one of the other challenges that we, of course, face is that the university is simultaneously putting a lot of pressure on us to publish and to do research. And it's very difficult to juggle those two. To do your teaching in the best possible way that you can, and simultaneously find time for research and for involvement in the sociological community, for example.
Well, it sounds like one of the ways that you've attempted to deal with that challenge is that actually have a certain overlap between the challenges you face in teaching and actually the research that you're doing.
Yes, yeah. Yes. And it's one of the things that I also find rewarding is that we have over the years developed a kind of practice in my department where we each do our own individual research, because we each have our own individual research interests, but that we also collaborate, and that we find a project that we can all more or less work on, that the theme is broad enough so that we can satisfy our own personal interests, but that we can also collaborate and work together, and in that way produce some interesting work. Right. We have recently completed a project on exclusion, citizenship, and social capital, of which the book should come out hopefully next year.
So, and I mean, we've talked a bit about your research on whistleblowing, a bit about your research on higher education. Could you also perhaps maybe tell us a little bit about the research that you've done on HIV and AIDS as well?
HIV and AIDS, my HIV and AIDS research started initially as one of these joint projects as well that we did in the department. And one of the major things that we did was a number of years ago, it was about 2000, there were lots of concerns in South Africa, especially about university students and about the prevalence rates among young people in particular, but then university students also. And we were interested in finding out what the situation was with regard to university students. So we did quite a big project on our own campus. And to our surprise, and against the expectations from everybody, we found that the prevalence was actually fairly low. And but the positive spin on that, the positive outcome from that as well, was up until that point, my university didn't provide any kind of medical facilities on campus or support. There were no condoms made available and nothing like that. And since then, the university has implemented, we've now got a VCT clinic on campus, but that campus is, the clinic has now developed as broader than just dealing with HIV and AIDS issues. It also provides general support to students, referrals, and sort of like basic medical needs of the students that are provided in. So I find that quite rewarding. Yes. That sometimes your research can also lead to some practical improvements in the day-to-day lives of your respondents.
Yes, yes. So, Dr. Oos, we're, have a little bit of time left, and the one final question that I would like to pose for you today is, if you had not become a sociologist, if this hadn't been the career trajectory that you chose for yourself, what else do you think that you might have been interested in pursuing?
Well, when I was a little girl, I thought I was going to become a ballerina, which was a totally unrealistic ideal, because I grew up in the rural areas. There was no ballet teacher within 100 square miles, or even more than that. But I was convinced, and I took out this book from the library and I practiced those exercises. But by the time I reached high school, I realized that this was not going to happen. As far as careers are concerned, well, as I told you, I landed up being a sociologist by accident. There were various stages when I considered other careers. One that I considered was law. And even at the end of my first degree, we had done a course in communication law that was offered by one of the law professors. And he was encouraging me to change direction and to become a lawyer rather. But in the end, I decided to stay with sociology.
And luckily for us, you did, yes. Well, doctors, I want to thank you very much for being with us. It's been really, really wonderful having the time to have this discussion with you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
This has been another journey through sociology with Dr. Tina Oos. Please join us next time when our guest will be Dr. Yoshimichi Sato from Japan.